So good afternoon again, everybody. I'm so pleased to see so many wonderful faces today. I hope you enjoyed lunch and you're enjoying your coffee and dessert. Before I introduce our speaker, I did have one more announcement I just wanted to share. I know that many of you are aware of our sisterhood group, the Soup Schwesters, that make delicious homemade soup, and they freeze them in the freezer just outside our kitchen for anyone who could use some soup at home. And we have a lot of soup. So if you know someone who might like to have a little soup and you would like to drop it at a friend's, or if you yourself would love a little bit of soup, we would love to distribute that after our program today. So I think you can speak with Eve. Eve, can you wave? Eve Silverman. And she'd be happy to give you some soup to share. Okay. It's good soup. We have testimonials here. So I am very honored to welcome our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Laura Lieber, I should say Dr. Rabbi Laura Lieber, who is a professor of religion at the University of Regensburg in Germany. We're very honored that Dr. Lieber is here in Vancouver to give a lecture tomorrow at UBC, and thought it would be wonderful to invite her to share some of her knowledge at Temple Sholom and to get to know our community as well. So Dr. Lieber has been at the University of Regensburg just for a little over a year, but has held wonderful faculty positions at Middlebury College in Vermont and Duke University in North Carolina. Can people hear? Yeah, okay. The sound is muffled. It is the curse of the social hall. So if you, after I introduce, if you are having trouble hearing, if you want to move your chair to another spot in the room, if that might be better, you can try. We'll both try to hold the microphone close. Oh, and if anyone would like a listening device, that can help too, to hear more clearly. So I'll just mention a little bit about Dr. Lieber earned her PhD from the University of Chicago. And as I mentioned, she's also an ordained rabbi from the Hebrew Union College, where Rabbi Dan and Cantor Cohen, Rabbi Feinstein, and myself all studied for our ordination. And Dr. Lieber grew up in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which, a cheer for the Arkansas, for the Razorbacks, which is a connection we share because my grandmother was actually from Arkansas. Yeah, I'll tell you more about that later if you're interested. But she's served a number of small southern synagogues as well throughout her career, which is wonderful. And her primary research is on the history of liturgical piyut, which are kind of synagogue poetry that are really beautiful of the late antique and Byzantine eras. But today she's really going to focus on more the history of Regensburg, where she lives, and the Jewish community there, and we're delighted to have you to teach us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much for the welcome. I was so excited to be invited because the Regensburg synagogue, I'm having to get used to the feedback. It's a community that's been very welcoming to me and my family, and I work a lot with the community in Regensburg, the Jüdische Gemeinde, but it's Orthodox. And while the rabbi there calls me rabbi, and the head of the congregation, the president of the community, is a fascinating woman, and she's been nothing but open. it still feels a little bit like a homecoming to be in a Reform synagogue where I'm speaking English and not carefully rehearsing a few German sentences that I then may or may not understand the other person's response. Because I can tell you now, everyone always wants to know, I was hired by the University of Regensburg as part of what they call internationalization, which means they want me to teach in English. And they see no reason to encourage me too much to learn German. So it's this first year, I've not done as much of my homework as I should in that regard. However, one of the courses I teach almost every semester is actually a course on Jewish life in Regensburg. And I know some of you have probably been on the Viking cruises. I know at least one of my table mates has, where you jump off the boat on the Danube and you run around the different cities on the river. And you may, depending on your tour guide, see some of the Jewish sites. And one of the treats for me as a faculty member is that I get to teach in depth the Jewish history of Regensburg, which was really, it's that Jewish history is why I'm there to a large extent. If you in synagogue ever heard or sang the song Anim Zmirot, that was written in Regensburg. So the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pietists of Ashkenaz, who I'll talk about briefly, were from Regensburg. Regensburg was one of the most important cities in Ashkenaz. It was really kind of a rival to the cities of Shum, Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, which if you've been on a Rhine River cruise, you may have gotten out and seen. I love how many visitors I get now that I live in Regensburg. All my family wants to come see me now. They were much less excited to come see me in North Carolina or Arkansas. So I'm just going to give you a very brief synopsis of the Jewish history of Regensburg, which in some ways is itself a little synopsis of the Jewish history in Ashkenaz. And then I can say a little bit about what it is that I'm doing, but I'm also very happy to entertain your questions when we're done. And this PowerPoint is mostly for pictures, because I figure my words, sometimes I think they're interesting and sometimes they're not, but pictures are somehow always interesting. And to start, I have here, just on this opening slide, from about the 13th century, this was a seal, so it was used to seal official documents. But it just says that it's the seal of the Kahal of Regensburg. And so it's sort of a symbol of the official Jewish life in this medieval city. And it's a six-pointed star, and then the moon. So I don't know that anyone really knows exactly the significance of the moon. But then the Hebrew around the rim, and that this is so it's used for sealing official documents. When the community would do things, as you'll see, like buy a piece of land from the monastery of St. Emmeram's to become the Jewish cemetery. So this is just a little timeline of what I'll be talking about, the main points in the Jewish history of Regensburg. So we have, Jews first moved officially to this region in the Carolingian period, so under the reign of Charlemagne the Great, although there were Jews there from back in the 1st, 2nd century when the Romans were there. There's usually an assumption that wherever the Roman army went, all sorts of other Romans also went, which would have included Jews. But we don't have any traces of the Jewish life there until the Carolingian period. The first actual written evidence of Jews in Regensburg is from 981, which actually refers to a Jew in the context of a land transaction. And then the Jewish quarter was established about 1020 of the Common Era. There was the period of the First Crusade and some forced conversions, although by the standards of the Rhineland, what Regensburg experienced could have been worse. We'll leave it there for the moment. Then we have the rise of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the family of Shmuel HaChasid and Yehuda HaChasid, and Sefer Hasidim, which is really the most important work we have, literary work of medieval Judaism. I also will share with you a little bit about medieval anti-Judaism in Regensburg, the expulsion of the Jews in 1519, their return just about a century and a half later, and then there's another synagogue, and then again about a century, 2 centuries of tranquility, sort of, Kristallnacht, the destruction of that synagogue, and then the period of modern renewal and recovery. I have a friend from grad school who studies Jews in Andalusia, Jews in southern Spain, and shortly before she made her first trip to Germany for a conference, I warned her, I said, at some point you'll have a friend walking you around town and they will point and say, this is where the synagogue used to be. Regensburg has a lot of those places. There used to be a lot of different synagogues. And there's a mikveh and all the other traces of Jewish daily life. So just to show you on a map there, where we are, and here I'm going to walk. So the elites of the Jewish community, so like Shmuel HaChasid and Yehuda HaChasid. Yehuda HaChasid is the one who wrote Anim Zmirot. They trace their origins to the Jewish community in Italy, so a town of Lucca, just near Pisa. And Charlemagne the Great invited the Jews of Lucca and that area up into Germany, and Regensburg is here. So, and as we were talking at lunch, the Bavarian dialect of German sounds a lot like Yiddish to this day. And I enjoy the sound, although people who live in the Swabian region will say that their German is closer to Yiddish. And Yiddishists just argue. So, but it's a very soft. It makes Regensburg sound homey to me in a way, because people are still very proud of their dialect, and I get to hear it a lot. So the Regensburg community is one of the oldest communities in Germany. It's probably about as old as this community in Cologne, which is far to the north. And here we have that document that I mentioned, the sale of land by the abbot of St. Emmeram's to the Jewish community, which became the cemetery. But you can see here how that seal was used. So lots of ribbons and seals. And I can tell you from personal experience that if you take a document to get it notarized in Germany to this day, it involves a weird amount of ribbons and things. It's not at all what I was expecting, and I'm not sure it's what the car title company wanted either, but that's what the lawyer did. And so the community began apparently just as is so often the case with a few mercantile families coming, and Regensburg it's the northernmost point of the Danube, and it was a major hub of commerce. It was a thriving and important medieval city. It was a free city. There were many, many churches, but it was Regensburg was sort of an independent kingdom, which meant that especially because it controlled that bridge over the Danube River, that it could tax people coming and going. And so long as the river was the major engine of the economy, Regensburg was a thriving city. And the Jewish quarter was located within the city walls, and it was never sort of a ghetto. It was very much a centrally located. And while it was a diverse community, and we can reconstruct actually the diversity of the community from some of their medieval writings in terms of, we have writings about how Jewish doctors should treat non-Jewish patients, how to treat your Christian servants. You have a sense of a very integrated community from the medieval period, which is a little different, I think, from how we often think about it. That the position of the Jews essentially tracked the position of the city. And so when Regensburg as a city was doing well, the Jewish community was doing well. And as the fortune of the city declined, the position of the Jews became vulnerable. The period of the First Crusade was, of course, not good for the Jews. There were the preachers, so Peter the Hermit and various other sort of voices that encouraged violence against the Jewish community in Germany came through Regensburg. And Peter the Hermit oversaw the Danube River was consecrated and basically turned into holy water, the whole river, and the Jews were all mass forcibly baptized, which, as I said, in that, and then about a year or so later, the Emperor Henry IV undid that. Basically, the church also said it was a problem to turn the entire Danube into holy water. There were complications from that to do with Christian theology that made other uses of the river a problem if the whole river is holy water. And the forcible conversions were undone, and the Jews of Regensburg were all allowed to re-Judaize, which is one reason, actually, that Shmuel HaChassid moved there from Speyer, because Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, the sort of the heart of Ashkenaz, there's where we had the spectacles of mass martyrdom and great bloodshed. The Jewish community of Regensburg got dunked and forced to live as Christians for a period of time, but we do not have any record of mass murder or suicides or things like that. And so, in general, there's a sense that again, because they were an imperial city and the emperor had sort of direct protection over them, the Jewish community of Regensburg had a slightly safer position at that time. So, but the traces of this trauma are still all over the writings of this time. And I also, because I'm kind of a medievalist, and I really love that we have this page this is a Franconian Machzor, so it's from a part of Germany, it's a little north of Regensburg. And it's a piyut, a late antique piyut for Passover, Iti Milvanon, so come with me from the Lebanon. And in this one, the decoration is the two knights fighting, which just shows you how much the medieval imagery from the larger world had penetrated sort of the Jewish imagination. And we have at this same time period, we have the Book of the Pious, for example, Judah the Pious, Yehuda HaChassid, makes statements like you should not put your book of romances, by which he means like Arthurian tales. You should not put your book of romances on top of your Bible. That your Bible should always sit on top of your romances, which is just, and it actually even uses a Middle French word, romance, for these romances, which it's fascinating to me that he assumes that his readers might be familiar with these things, because from my perspective, there was really nothing more Christian than like King Arthur stories, where they're always searching for the Holy Grail and things. But they were very much a part of the medieval Jewish world too, including the visual world. So that takes us to the Hasidei Ashkenaz. And the interior picture here, if you've been to Worms, which I always have to say at Worms because my kids laugh if I say Worms, but the city of Worms, it's not intact, it's been rebuilt, but that's what the interior of the synagogue in Regensburg in the 12th century looked something like. We have the foundations. Like when you study late antiquity, you just have floors. So we have the foundations of the synagogue in Regensburg, and we can tell that the floor plan was very similar, which isn't surprising when the Jewish community came from this area. They probably brought their idea of what a nice synagogue looks like. So we have Samuel the Pious of Speyer, his son, Judah the Pious of Regensburg, and Judah the Pious is the main author of Sefer Hasidim, the Book of the Pious. And the Hasidim, they're not the Hasids like we have now. It's not like they were Lubavitchers. They were Hasidim because they were sort of extra pietistic. So they objected to a lot of the regular rituals that other Jews were doing as being inappropriate. You actually get the sense from reading their works that they were probably a little bit difficult to get along with. They would always probably be criticizing what their neighbors were doing. But they objected to people swearing oaths. They objected to the rituals you may have heard at the beginning of school, where letters of the Hebrew alphabet or things would be written on honey cakes and eaten. They objected to the ritual with the honey cakes, with writing the letters on cakes and the children to make Torah learning sweet. They objected to that because to them it looked a little bit Eucharistic, which it probably was. There was a lot about eating and religion and things in this period. But at the same time, they were also into penitence in a way that other Jews said, that goes too far. So we have a lot of Jews arguing with other Jews. And they were very concerned that if you're overcome with lustful thoughts for your neighbor's wife, you should go immerse yourself in the snow, which hopefully you have a nice private snowbank in your backyard. Otherwise, everyone, I guess, would know that you were having lustful thoughts. I don't know. But sort of these penitential rituals, which to us may seem like the kinds of things that monks were doing, where you afflict your body to purify your soul in a way. So there's a lot of fasting and other rituals, such as memorial candles and saying Yizkor prayers and lighting Yahrzeit candles. All of these things emerge in this context and in dynamic with the way piety was understood by this community. We have a lot of traces from the Sefer Hasidim of just how entwined the Jewish and Christian communities were, not just land transactions, but Judah the Pious permitted, if a woman had to travel by herself, she was allowed to dress as a nun, under the belief that nuns would not be as subject to violence by others, by Christians or crusaders, and if she, and she's even allowed to say, if a Jew tries to attack her because she's a nun, which is an interesting passage, then she's allowed, to cry for help and to bring the Christian authorities, even though she'd be essentially turning in one of her fellow Jews, that she's allowed to protect her virtue that way. And so it's an interesting, because in general they prohibit being mistaken for Christians, but when it comes to protecting your bodily integrity, you're allowed to masquerade as a Christian. And when you think about that, means wearing like a big cross and a nun's habit, and it's not a casual thing to impersonate a nun. But that was permitted. And at the same time, it says that you should not have a window of your house that opens to a church. You shouldn't, and it has many rules. So any of us who sort of grew up hearing things about keeping your distance from a church or other things, that way of being Jewish in some way quite possibly traces back to Sefer Hasidim. I could go on a lot about that, but I won't. It's full of all sorts of interesting details of daily life. One more thing, just because of Halloween coming up, there's a story about a man who was very wealthy, who falls on hard times, and his daughter dies, and it is discovered when some young rapscallions are in the cemetery at Hoshana Rabbah, because that's when the ghosts come out and pray. It's really strange Ashkenazi folklore in there. The ghosts come out on a Hoshana Rabbah and pray, and these young men want to eavesdrop on the ghosts, and all the ghosts are coming out, and except one, the daughter of this rich man who has fallen on hard times, and the ghosts say, "Come out and join us. We're all going to shul," basically, we're all praying for our living relatives. And she says, "I can't come out. My father didn't provide me with a burial shroud. I'm naked. Basically, can someone throw me a robe?" And so this poor young ghost is trapped in her tomb because her cheapskate father didn't bury her properly, and this is all revealed. There's some kind of warning in there somewhere. But I just like the fact that the ghost is modest. and apparently even after death, you can't just sort of cloud yourself a robe of some kind. Okay. Regensburg had its share of medieval anti-Judaism. The most infamous one is the Judensau, which is on the outside of the Regensburg Cathedral, facing towards the Jewish quarter. It's not ambiguous. But there are other depictions of Jews throughout the cathedral, which are really fascinating. So they're like Jews worshiping the golden calf, and Moses wearing a Jew's hat receiving the Torah from Jesus. Something is going on there. But the Judensau is a distinctly German expression of anti-Judaism. Many different cathedrals in Germany have the depiction of Jews, in this case, suckling from a pig's tits. And it's quite worn, and actually in situ, sort of on the cathedral, there's a quite large sign now explaining the imagery and its history, and attempting to contextualize it. This Germany struggles a lot with how to mark this history. There was a big discussion in the 90s about, should it be removed? Should it be contextualized? The one thing they knew is they couldn't just leave it. And there's no synagogue and ecclesia, to my sadness, because I would really love it if I didn't have to go to Bamberg for a synagogue and ecclesia. And this is just a contemporary depiction of a Franciscan monk preaching, and you have demons and Jews and things. So, but that's a famous Regensburg manuscript. There was also a blood libel, and we see it was people who claim to be witnesses to the martyrdom of Simon of Trent sort of took their show on the road, and we had an episode of blood libel accusation in Regensburg, which is recorded in this. So you see here it's 6 Knaben zu Regensburg von den Juden ermordet. So six lads in Regensburg murdered by the Jews. And this is clearly modeled on the imagery of Simon of Trent. And so we see here a depiction of this in a woodcut, which on the far side here, you can see that in Die Stürmer is being reused. And then this image is from the ceiling of a church in Regensburg, which I bet no riverboat cruise goes into. But it's St. Cassian's Church, and it would be the size, that this medallion would be the size of probably about a quarter of the ceiling of this room. It's huge. And you can see here the murdered children, like from here. These are the Jews being stepped on by the personification of Regensburg, Ratisbon, and the Virgin Mary smiles on. Here in the background, because this image is 18th century, but it celebrates the expulsion of the Jews in 1519. So here they're tearing down the synagogue and the Jewish quarter. You can see here the 10 Commandments. And here are the Jews fleeing over the stone bridge to the city of Stadt am Hof. And so this is a very disturbing, I actually find this more disturbing than the Judensau. And again, there's a QR code. You go in and you can get an explanation about the image, but it's an active church. Yeah?
Could you please explain a little more what the blood libel is?
Okay. So one of the blood libel, in short, is the idea that Jews used the blood of a Christian child as part of the Passover ritual. So what you see here is they are bleeding a child and catching the blood in bowls to put in the matzah. So it's an accusation of ritual murder. It emerged part and parcel alongside accusations of host desecration, which is where Jews would manage to acquire a consecrated communion wafer and then reenact the crucifixion on it. Those images are a little bit more surreal because it's just like a wafer being tortured. Here it's a child. It first appeared in England in the Middle Ages. There are many theories, that it may reflect some discomfort with really thinking through the Eucharist and what it means to take seriously, this is my body and this is my blood. But it led to waves of murders, and there were blood libel accusations against the Jews during the 20th century, and this kind of imagery still appears in anti-Semitic illustrations today. So this accusation is very deep, which is one reason why I wanted this image and the way you see it being directly appropriated by the Nazis. But it continues to the present in other sort of contexts. I have to say, and I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A, that in the wake of October 7th, Germany is actually one of the easiest places to be. It came up yesterday. I didn't think to put a picture of it, but at the university where I am now, because they're a partner university with Ben Gurion University, they've had posters up since October 7th of all the hostages that were connected to Ben Gurion University in the Negev saying, "Bring our hostages home," which is not something that could have happened at Duke, where I was for 17 years beforehand. So, and just continuing. So that was 1519 and the destruction. Albrecht Altdorfer was on the city council of Regensburg, so the artist, and because everyone was waiting for the Emperor Maximilian to die so that they could expel the Jews. It was a very convenient way to cancel your debts. And so Albrecht Altdorfer, knowing that the king was failing and that the expulsion order would come soon, went and made a series of engravings, actually, of the synagogue as a form of record keeping because he knew it would be destroyed. I find that chilling to me that these are the only pictures we have of this Gothic interior synagogue, but that they were made by this famous artist so coldly. This is the church that was put up in the Jewish quarter. It became a major Marian shrine after the synagogue was torn down. It was a synagogue and the yeshiva and everything. It was a major Jewish center. And then the cemetery was also, we know where it was, but it's not been excavated. It's near the main train station. But a number of tombstones were taken, and they show up in different places all over the area, including many of them built into buildings as triumphant symbols. The most disturbing one, and the one, like I mentioned, I have teenagers, and so of course one of our first trips when we were in the city was, let's go to the torture museum. Who doesn't like a good medieval torture museum? It's like the Tower of London or something. In one of the pits, like deep sort of underground, meters and meters underground, sort of an isolation cell where someone would be kept, the latrine seat is the tombstone of Gittel Bas David. All the tombstones that appear as spolia around Regensburg are the tombstones of women, and no one knows why. It is not clear if it was misogynistic, if it was a way of saying, and especially your women, or if it had to do with the part of the cemetery from which the stones were taken. No one knows. But they're all women, and I think most people agree that Gittel Bas David did not deserve this. And I have a friend who is a medieval historian in Munich, her medieval Jewish history, and her criteria of a good tour guide at the torture museum is if they mention, if they highlight what was done to Gittel, or if they try to sort of not mention it. Because it's not readily visible. It's way down deep in this hole of isolation, where prisoners were isolated. It's also worth noticing, after the expulsion of the Jews, that's when we have the wave of witch trials. Because without the Jews as scapegoats, they had to find new scapegoats, which apparently were women. So they just went. But there's a huge wave for a good century and a half of witch trials. If you go there, one of the other things you see in Regensburg is the house where the physicist Johannes Kepler lived, because it was the last place Kepler lived in his life. And I don't think the official tours often mention that he was in Regensburg to help defend his mother, who was on trial as a witch. So not in Regensburg, but he wanted to be closer to where his mom was on trial. She got off. But Rivka Galchen wrote a fantastic novel about Kepler's mother called Everyone Knows Your Mother's a Witch. Okay, so then we had Jews returned after a century and a half of keeping away, and then we have sort of this early modern period of history, including the beautiful synagogue that was built in 1912. That's an exterior shot and an interior shot. That synagogue was destroyed on Kristallnacht. And here's some pictures of Jews being rounded up in a part of Regensburg that's quite recognizable if you're there. And then the Gestapo ordering the removal of the Jews. There is a major bus stop in town called Dachau-Platz, which we've had many discussions about the fact that I understand the spirit of wanting to commemorate, sort of and atone for what transpired, because that Dachau-Platz is where the Jews were deported from to Dachau. But I kind of wish I didn't have to be reminded of it quite so often. My son wanted to know if there was a way that Jews could call it something else. And then coming here, we have, this is the sort of marble stones are the memorial that was built in the 90s to where the synagogue had been. They were actually they were clearing out the town square, and they found the foundations of the synagogue and actually much of the medieval Jewish quarter in the 90s. And there's now a museum and other things that you can visit, and you can sort of get a sense of it underground. But on the surface level, they built this memorial by Danny Caravan, an Israeli artist, who also did the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. And so that's where the synagogue used to be. And then that building is the modern synagogue, which there are now about 1,200 Jews registered in Regensburg. The majority are from the former Soviet Union. The population was something like 400 in 1985, and then suddenly it skyrockets after 1989. So it's a significant Russian population. And then there's other communities in the area, like Straubing, which is not too far, has a separate community. And I'm happy to tell you more about the living Jewish community. When I teach the Jewish Regensburg class, we always start in the synagogue, because I want my students to know that Jews are still a living part of German society. I don't want Jews to be past tense. Yeah?
I wonder whether there is something special about the architecture of the new synagogue, because I've been in Duisburg, and the synagogue there, seeing it reminded me of the synagogue in Duisburg.
I don't know how many architects there are designing these. This building was specifically, the city funded it, and its big inaugural was actually in 2019, They wanted 500 years since the expulsion of the Jews. It was, again, a sort of act of atonement. It's a beautiful building, and there's a lot of, it's actually really impressive architecturally, just how sort of, well, the acoustics are great. And the way it intentionally uses light and other things. I like this one much better than the synagogue in Mainz, which is designed to make you uncomfortable. It's supposed to be unsettling, and it's like doesn't have right angles, and and I'm thinking, like, I want my synagogue to be a place of comfort. The outside world is topsy-turvy enough. I don't need my synagogue to manifest that energy, but no one asked me. So one of the things that you can see here, all the glass. There's actually a lot of glass. It is all heavily, I don't know the right term for it. It's like, it's more than bulletproof. I think it's like armored vehicle proof. The synagogue was set to open just after the attack in Halle. There was the knife attack where several, I think several Jews and maybe some non-Jews were murdered outside the synagogue in Halle. And the German government mandated security standards for all synagogues after that. So they had to go through and sort of harden the building. And, but it was important to the Jewish community to be as open as they could be, so they have all this glass. Yeah. Yes? Yeah, that's the library. That's the synagogue's library, and there are, during regular hours, you'll often see senior citizens often are sort of in there reading and things. It's not a synagogue you can just drop by. You have to, the security consciousness is very noticeable. I think this is true for many places in Europe. But even my students, when you go in, it's sort of like an airlock. You all go in, and then the door shuts, and only once you're all in, then the doors to the inside open. So. And then to transition to the present, I just threw in here, because I didn't know what you want to, that's me with the president of the university. When I was hired, one of the things I'm supposed to do is help them build up a program in Jewish studies. And then because I am from Arkansas, that's the Hillel house where we had services when I was growing up, and my parents are both in there. That's now like a parking garage. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's the new synagogue building, Temple Sholom, in Northwest Arkansas, where my mom and my sister and everybody still goes. So anyway, that was like a course that I do over the span of several days, where we're hiking all over town and students are doing little reports. I tried to give you a very quick summary, but I'm happy to take questions.
Regensburg means rain city. Is it rainy?
Well, I wouldn't want to say to anyone in Vancouver that it's rainy. It's actually it's named after the Regen River. So the Regen and the Danube are the two rivers that come together there. But it is definitely on the foggy, rainy side in the winter. Summers are beautiful.
I'm curious about who your students are. Who's coming to take your courses?
That's great. Yeah, this is my third semester, and I would say my first semester, almost all my students were actually international students, because I think I was an unknown quantity, and so the international students were the ones who, they were new, so they didn't really worry, and I was teaching in English, which was the most important thing for them. I'm getting more and more students who are German-born. I do have Jewish students who are German-born. Some come, because Regensburg is about an hour and a half north of Munich. So the towns and the villages are between Munich and in sort of a circle around Regensburg. Like Straubing, I mentioned, has a nice little Jewish community also. So I have some students some Jewish students who come from there. Most of my students are either international students. I've even had a couple Israelis, which I find funny. An Israeli comes to Germany to take a Jewish studies class. But the German students, most of them are actually studying to become teachers. That's a significant number of the students in general at the University of Regensburg are studying to become teachers. And teachers in Germany have to have sort of two majors. They have to have sort of two major concentrations. And my students usually have a concentration in English, which makes them unafraid to take a course with me, and then a concentration in religion and ethics, which all students in the German secondary schools take every semester. They have a class in religion or ethics. And so it can be Protestant theology, Catholic theology, or ethics. In some of the bigger schools, there will be other religions. It's an interesting compromise for church and state. But so most of my students are coming from that background. Yes?
As a person who spent a bit of the time studying and writing about the history of Jews in Germany, I just want to begin by thanking you for teaching me things I didn't know. And one of them is this fascinating story about Jewish women being encouraged or permitted to dress as nuns to travel, and much else, which I won't repeat. My question arises from an experience I've had about 15 years ago. I was invited to give a lecture in German, in the synagogue of Braunschweig, this town in northern Germany where my mother had grown up. And it was about, I titled it auf Deutsch, three generations of Jewish women in Braunschweig. My mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, I didn't know my great-grandmother. And I was curious when I asked the question of the congregation before my lecture who would be attending and whether there would be members of the congregation attending. She said, well, very few will come because all the members of our congregation are Jews from the former Soviet Union. They don't really have good enough German to follow a lecture, and beyond that, they're not particularly interested in the history of this town before the war. It was very well attended, but the audience consisted of members of the Braunschweig Historical Society, the intelligentsia of the community. Those people were interested in the history of Jews in their own town. And I wonder if you could make any comparison, not so much with your international students at the university, but your sense of who are the people in Regensburg who are interested in the Jewish history of their own community? Who are the people who are behind these initiatives to honor and respect the Jewish community? Are there Jewish members of the Jewish community in Regensburg who are interested in this? So what would be your sense of the profile of people most committed to learning about and supporting and honoring the Jewish history of their community?
No, that sounds like very typical of a lot of German cities, what you described in Braunschweig. The rabbi, the senior rabbi at the Jewish community in Regensburg, even now, though most of the Jews from the former Soviet Union who were there came in the late 80s and 90s, and at this point are speaking decent German, I don't see a lot of them at the events. I think the rabbi does sort of shiurim specifically for them. You do see younger members of the congregation, and this is where even the students that I see, the undergraduates are sort of third generation from that. Their grandparents. I never see the young people at the synagogue. The synagogue, I'm going to write an article someday on the trippy scene at the synagogue, because I will tell people that it's an Orthodox synagogue, but the only Orthodox Jew is the rabbi. And that's because most of the people who are going there are Jews from the former Soviet Union, and the poor rabbi is always having to tell people to please turn off their phones. And, and I meant that, please turn off your phones. He's just, because they're, and sometimes when he's walking around, then you'll see people hide their phones, like they're school kids, like the rabbi's coming around. The women's gallery where I sit, there's the one woman who, she comes and she brings the coupons for all the different grocery stores, and everyone gets excited when she comes. And there's another woman who's always doing word puzzles on her phone, and the rabbi's yelling, be quiet up there. And there's this one young woman I noticed her from the first time I went. She was so seriously davening. She was the one person who was really there to pray. And she has been studying to convert for 5 years. And I honestly think they will not let her convert until she marries, because I think they are afraid that the rabbinut in the areas will not they want her, they're worried, I think, about creating an intermarriage. I think they're worried that if they convert her, then she might marry someone who is not Jewish. And so I think until she finds that nice Israeli guy to marry, that she's just going to be forever davening up in the women's gallery. She is the most respected member of the Jewish community next to the rabbi in some ways, I think. But she's not even halakhically a Jew. But the community in some ways regards her that way. The members of the local population, though, are very invested in many different ways in the Jewish community. The synagogue does host a lot of events and readings and other things, and some of the congregation members will come to those. But the larger community, and then again, I moved there. I accepted the position in the summer of 2024, but after October 7th, I think there's been a large and outspoken embrace of the Jewish community, even on the different anniversaries, and there's a big leftist movement in Regensburg. It's a college town, it's sort of a Green Party area, but they're very explicitly pro-Israel also. So, which I think it's actually not unusual in Germany outside. In Berlin and Munich, it would be more complicated, but this is a little Bavarian town, and Bavaria is the Texas of Germany. So it's, but no, I will say I actually went, I can't remember exactly when, to a rally that had to do with the German elections. And I was curious, actually, because I wanted to see, this was in the fall last year, I wanted to see what the politics would be like, because I knew exactly what they would be like in Durham and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And there was one person who appeared there with a Palestinian flag before it started, and the organizers of the rally, which was an anti-AFD, anti-right wing, it was Musk had been saying things, and but the organizers went up to the person with the Palestinian flag and said, "That's not what we're talking about today. Could you please put your flag away?" And the flag was put away before the rally started. So it was not a confrontation, but it was just, I was saying sort of to Rabbi Brown yesterday that sometimes it feels almost like we're in a negative pressure chamber where it's almost intentionally being kept at bay. And when people say the war or other things in Regensburg, they mean Ukraine. Ukraine is much closer. So we have, I can't remember the population numbers. I know that actually population number-wise is the same size basically as Durham, North Carolina. But I can't remember. I would have to look. I'm so bad with numbers. I know what the Jewish population is, but it's very small compared to the rest of it. Sure, you can look that up. Yeah.
So, with the university and the education system there, do they have any focus on Holocaust studies?
They have a large center for what they call memory studies, which to me means Alzheimer's unit, but they mean memorialization, and they have a close connection with the Flossenburg concentration camp. And so it's not explicitly Holocaust studies, it's broader than that, and actually, so they would include like my work on the Crusades and things within that umbrella of memory and memorialization. Holocaust is a very central part of the school curricula. And part of my task, it's different there from what it is in the US, but at the same time, I sort of feel like it's also the same in that I always want my students to know that Jews have done more on the historical scene than show up and get murdered, so the population of Regensburg, Germany was 174,000 in 2025. Thank you. So, and basically, and about a little over 1,000 Jews, so that gives you a sense of the percentage.
So you started to say, before the phone came up with the population, that you had a different approach in Germany and in the States when you teach. So
Yeah.
can you elaborate on that a bit also?
I think, well, American students, you can't always know how much they know about the Holocaust. I think, they may have usually they've read Elie Wiesel's Night. They may have read The Diary of Anne Frank. But it's usually been universalized and it sort of becomes a story for everyone kind of thing. I think I have some real thoughts about how the Holocaust is taught, at least in the public school and the settings that I've experienced. In Germany, it's much more personal. I think because many people, it's still tensions around family legacy, and you're there where it happened. It's not an abstraction. And there, sometimes I try to push back on the privileging almost of Jews. The sort of Jews are almost sort of sainted. They're and in part it's also because students so rarely meet a Jew. I think about the difference in the United States, even, especially in a university setting, most of my students at Duke University were not Jewish, but most of them had like a Jewish friend growing up, and they'd been to a bar bat mitzvah. They had some sense of Judaism, whereas I will even now have colleagues at the university who will come up to me and they'll be so excited to say, like, I got to go into a synagogue. And you'll realize, and they'll be like, this is the first time this person's ever been in a, and that's just so different, because, I'm just coming from the American context, and I just told my students the difference between being in a place where 2 to 3% of the population is Jewish versus 0.2 or 3% of the population is Jewish is huge. Growing up in Arkansas, there were not a lot of other Jewish kids, and I sort of joke that I was always an expat. My parents were New Yorkers who ended up in Arkansas, and so they were strangers in a strange land. And now I'm just, I'm in a different place, making my way. But the difference, Germany is haunted in a way by the history. And the other thing I will say that I find interesting is there's a fantastic little 12-minute long documentary called The Walk, which is made by an American from Chicago who moved to Regensburg and decided to become a documentary filmmaker. And his first documentary was this little short film called The Walk about walking his dog around Regensburg as a Jew. His name's Adam Fried. And it really, he has all this archival footage from the war especially. And I have all my students, in any class I teach, I always have them watch it because it's 12 minutes, it's subtitled in German, it's easy. And I have students who grew up in Regensburg who'd never seen any of the footage that he found. I've had students, I made an offhand comment about how Luther liked the Jews for 15 minutes. And I've had every semester, because my classes are small, I have sort of an exit interview with the students, and I ask them, 10 years from now, what do you think you'll remember from this class? Because I really want to know what's working, what isn't working, but that's one of my questions. And I had a student who was one of these high school teachers-to-be who mentioned that she'd grown up in a Protestant family, and no one had ever told her that Luther liked the Jews, but no one had ever told him that he didn't. And so she mentioned, that she had been so quiet all semester. And this was one of those throwaway things you say in front of a group of students. And she said that she went home that weekend and she asked her father and her grandmother and her childhood pastor, and she did all this reading about Luther and the Jews. And she said, I will never teach that the way that I was taught. And I'm thinking, how could you be German and teach Lutheran theology and not talk about that? So I'm also learning that I can't just assume how things have been taught. But any other questions?
Probably a good stopping point.
So thank you very much, Dr. Lieber, on behalf of Temple Sholom and our Shalom Shishim Seniors Program. That was so fascinating, and I know that hopefully if there are more riverboat cruisers or German tourists coming to Regensburg, they'll have a really wonderful background to explore. And yes, a good connection. Wonderful. Well, great to see everyone. Remember, if you'd like soup, to speak to Eve, and wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.